Welcome back to Seek Strength, and today's video is brought to you by, of course, our Combat Sports Strength Training Program. This is 10 weeks in length, 6 weeks of primary strength training, and then 4 weeks of power training in the gym. This does not include your conditioning. It is 4 sessions a week, but it has been done across the course of about 20 weeks, where people have done between 2 and 3 sessions a week and not done the 4 sessions a week, and has worked very well for them. A lot of people have great success for it, so I would encourage you to try it if you're looking for some combat sports strength training. Welcome back to questions and answers, the not live version. So we're back with our mixed martial arts, combat sports, jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, grappling, karate, striking, all those good sports. We're back with a Q&A for this because we haven't done one in a while, and we know there's a lot of you guys out there watching, so we wanted to get some specific questions and specific videos for you guys. So Joe writes up first. So a lot of great questions in these. Originally we'd planned to do those in kind of one video, but there's actually a lot of great questions, and there's a lot to some of the questions, so we'll be doing them bit by bit. First one is from Joe Wright. Could you talk a little bit about how the relative volume and intensity of gym sessions and sport-specific sessions should vary across 10 to 12 weeks leading up to a competition for judo, BJJ, MMA, etc.?
I think the easiest way to deal with this is talk about the gym work first. So say you're 12 weeks out from a competition, European seniors for judo or whatever. If you're looking at intensity, the first thing you're going to do is build intensity. So you'll start at the start with quite high volume work, quite low intensity work, and then that will be kind of an inverse relationship. So it'll be like a cross. You'll start with your high volume, the volume will taper down somewhere. If you're 12 weeks from competition, somewhere around week 8 or 9, that volume is going to be very low and the intensity is going to be very high. Then at around week 10, so week 9 going into week 10, you're just going to maintain a plateau. So your strength and power training is basically being done in month 1 and month 2. Month 3, you'll probably just maintain that strength and power work you've been doing. So quite moderate intensity, quite moderate volume. But for those first 2 months, you're going to start high volume, low intensity, and then you'll just switch those two around. The volume will gradually drop down. So you might start off with 5 sets of 10. You might finish with 3 sets of 3. You might start at 50% of 1RM and you might finish at 95% of 1RM. Then in your maintenance phase, that moderate period of training, you're probably doing 5x5, 3x5, 5x3, or 3x3, and then you're probably always working around kind of 80 to 85% of 1 rep max.
For sport specific sessions, these should be coming to a taper, so the opposite of your kind of volume for your gym sessions, so they'd be increasing in volume up until a peak, probably somewhere in the region of between 3 and 5 weeks out, depending on what kind of athlete you are, how much training you have to do, how much time you have to train, how much recoverability you have, how experienced an athlete you are, how important the fight is, how many subsequent fights you have after this. But for most people, I'd really like to see, for the amateur grappling or the amateur kind of combat sports athlete, I should say, not just grappling, I'd like to see the last 3 weeks to be fairly, at least no less than 3 weeks out, should be fairly intense and fairly high volume of sport specific sessions. I think a mistake we see sometimes with sport specific sessions for combat sports is the week of is tapered off too much. So in weightlifting we'll have a taper, for example, where we'll have like one heavy session, be very aggressive taper. In powerlifting we'll have even a more of an aggressive taper. Powerlifting peak week will be minimal effort at all, and that's very, very different because we're trying to dissipate a lot of fatigue for powerlifting in our strength sports, and we're trying to recover as much as possible, and then hopefully we're super compensating, and then by the time we get to the competition we're either fresh as we possibly can be, or we can knock flies with our hands, or we get to powerlifting competition we're as fresh as possible to display the most amount of force production we can get. However, with combat sports we're looking for something that is highly skill dependent and highly fitness dependent, and fitness drops off very, very fast. So we're talking about fitness in the general programming sense, so fitness often returns to a broad word where it's kind of what shape is this athlete in any sport fit for their competition. So this could mean literally judo all the way to weightlifting or powerlifting. So our fitness drops off, and to a certain extent if we stay away from our sport for too long, and this window for our peak fitness is quite low. It's somewhere in the region of kind of 3 to 5 days, and it's one of the reasons we saw other kind of programming styles develop around block periodization and kind of linear progression, that kind of thing. The argument for that was it's very hard sometimes, if not done correctly, for a peak fitness window to be exact. So what we see sometimes, if you drop off these sport specific sessions in combat sports too early, you'll lose a lot of fitness, a lot of sharpness, a lot of kind of game day readiness. So what we like to see is that peak volume and intensity, quote unquote, however you measure intensity for your sport, is about 3 weeks out for most people watching this, and then you keep that level. So that's quite a high intensity for a lot of people. That could be, for example, for jiu-jitsu, that could be 4 days of pretty tough rolling, you know, if you're somewhere in the region of 1.5 to 2 hour gym sessions, like as in actual in the BJJ gym, and then probably keep this intensity right up until the Wednesday, maybe even the Thursday of a fight on a Saturday. So almost certainly to the Wednesday, you keep this level of volume of rolling. You reduce the intensity in terms of how hard you were going for, say, Monday to Wednesday. So you keep your activity of rolling high. And we'd recommend a lot of back-to-back sessions, for example, for BJJ in that scenario, probably similar for judo and boxing. You'd keep those sessions quite high in intensity. You wouldn't be going as hard as possible like you would have been the previous week. So the previous 2 weeks of the last 3 weeks would have been quite hard in intensity. You would have been trying to murder your opponents as best as possible. You'd have been trying to do your best performance as sustained as we have possible across sessions. And then on the Monday to Wednesday, you're keeping those volume of sessions quite high and you're kind of doing them back to back, but you're dropping off that intensity just a little bit. So you're coming to kind of 20% less of that maximum intensity. So you're not going for that white knuckle gi grabbing, you know, you're not trying to hit your opponent as hard as possible. You're just reducing it back a little bit because you do also want some of that fatigue to dissipate and recoverability to happen while still balancing our performance and our fitness and keeping it as high as possible and the only way that stays high is by doing a lot of work and volume, you know. So it's a very fine balance. So we'll keep that volume of rolling or volume of striking or volume of throwing pretty high, but we'll just take that intensity back a small bit for a few days because the volume in itself will sustain it, and we want to drop some of that intensity, which is probably some of the most fatiguing parts of those sports. For example, maximal punching or maximal grappling or throwing is quite fatiguing. It's like essentially a plyometric movement, so we want to reduce the intensity of those down a little bit, and you'll have to modulate this between you and your coach and yourself as an athlete and let it drop off Monday through Wednesday. And then on the Thursday and Friday, particularly say if the fight was Saturday, keep Friday either very, very minimal and nothing at all, and then the Thursday about half as much as you did on that Monday through Wednesday.
The kind of almost obvious caveat to this is that combat sports are essentially sports that are designed for you to hurt somebody else, and when you're training in combat sports, it's inevitable that you're going to get hurt, right? So when you're building to this kind of like tremendous crescendo that Gerf is talking about, where everything is building up as much as you possibly can, the obvious caveat is that you have to be incredibly careful with the amount of damage you're taking. So if you're rolling with people and it's in that last 2 weeks, or you're striking with people and it's in that last 2 weeks, make sure we're not aggravating anything. Make sure you're not going with the people 3 weight classes above you, or make sure you're not going with the person who's extra spazzy and extra aggressive and extra violent. All of these things have to be monitored. Outside of the kind of general intensity, general volume, you do need to monitor that aggression slightly as well.
So just, and it's great that you guys are asking questions, and you're the athletes who don't need to hear this, but we'll say it anyway just in case someone else has kind of stumbled on our videos. You need to treat yourself like an athlete, you know, in combat sports. I think sometimes we see, and less so every year, I think athletes are getting a lot better with this, is that in combat sports, it used to be kind of seen as like an art, you know, an art in of itself, and you'd kind of, and of course that came from the martial arts aspect. There was no real like thought process behind the system of training behind athletes, but combat sports athletes are no different from any other athlete, and they're not treated any different way, and you need to have a periodized intelligent training system, a multi-year training plan for athletes if you want to be the best as we possibly can be. And it's great that you factor even thinking about training in 10 to 12 week blocks, you know. So a lot of you guys already know this, and that's why you're wondering about these details. But always bear in mind, you know, that there is nothing special about preparation for combat sports. You have your own sport specific stuff, of course, that you need to do, but you still need to treat yourself like a smart and intelligent athlete, and the same rules of biological adaptation and physiological stress and stuff all apply to combat sports athletes. If, of course, some of that stress might be a little bit more egregious to your body than other sports.
Basket weaving. Speed weaving.
Basketballing. B-balling. Up next, we have Erico Oliveira. So he is saying how much less of a priority is strength in non-grappling sports, example boxing and karate, so essentially striking sports, combat striking, combat sports, compared to sports with a grappling component. Does it make a huge practical difference in programming, exercise, etc.? Because Kevin Bueri is also saying, I do kickboxing on my strength training. I'm just wondering, the same shite.
I think you can view this in a general sense as the grappling sports, the wrestling sports, anything where you're really having to control someone. Your strength training, and particularly your kind of more towards strength than velocity, right? So your kind of stronger, your top end strength is very much performance enhancing. It's very much going to make a big difference to you as a player. In the striking sports, it's kind of support systems of that performance. So it's preventing injuries. It's making sure when you take impact, you're not going to fall apart. It's making sure that as you're up on your toes all the time, your legs are going to be strong. You'll be able to maintain strong positions if you're in like a single leg position. All of these things will support striking, but very much for the grappling sports, for judo, for wrestling, for jiu-jitsu, any of these things where we're having to pick people up and move them around. The strength training, and particularly the top end strength training, so your 1RM numbers are incredibly important. And I think there's mistakes made on both sides. So by the striking athletes who think you don't need any strength training, but also with the grappling athletes who think the top end strength isn't important and I just need to do my power work, or I just need to do my kind of movement work to make sure I have good movement or whatever. Top end strength is incredibly important. If you look at Olympic wrestlers, people who make their living off wrestling in a large sports structure, they'll pay massive amounts of attention to accruing muscle mass, building their 1RM numbers, and then as you've built to an incredibly high level of 1RM or general strength, you'll start converting that into more of your power work. You're kind of 75 to 85% of 1RM and moving that barbell very quickly.
For our grappling combat athletes, I would almost certainly, we would definitely try and be willing to sacrifice, or we would be willing to sacrifice sport specific training for periods throughout the year if the strength needed to be improved. Whereas on the opposite side of the coin, for those striking athletes, it's very rare you'd ever be in a scenario where you'd be really willing to sacrifice and be in this position where you really need to make some immediate strength gains in those kind of striking sports. So in those striking sports, you're always kind of thinking it as like performance supportive, as if you a turn of phrase, whereas for our grappling athletes, we're really looking for this as something that's performance enhancing. So you'd be really looking for our wrestlers and our judo and our BJJ, we're really looking for them to be as strong as possible. So there's points throughout the year where we're going to say, okay, is it possible that we could take maybe 8 to 10 weeks off, or do a lot less of our sport, or could we focus on it just a little bit less? Could we make it number 2 in our priorities as opposed to number 1, and then put in a position where if these athletes do need to be stronger, we can kind of bring that up as much as possible in that time frame, and then throughout the year we'll try and balance it as much as you possibly can. Whereas for our strikers, or for karate, boxing, taekwondo, anything like that, it's not often you'd really sacrifice a lot of sport specific stuff outside of intentional off seasons where there's a down period. There's not a lot of times where you'd really sacrifice it, because there just isn't that need to it, and it's hard to justify it, because whatever strength training you can typically do while being a smart athlete for those striking sports is usually enough. You know, you're looking for that speed and power. The strength training absolutely does help, of course, and that's why we've weight categories. That's why it makes a difference, those force production. Sometimes throughout the year, of course, for these striking athletes, we would take a period of time where you're in an off season and you use this to build some muscle and strength, but it would be less of a priority than it would be for these BJJ athletes, or for our judo or jiu-jitsu or something like that. You know, you'd actually be looking for those athletes to points a year where, like, look, I think in this scenario, if someone's trying to go as far as possible, you'd think maybe we take a longer term approach to this. Could we take more than an off season to try and build you up as much as possible? For example, if you have someone who's quite a high level belt, if they're a high level competitor and they're trying to get somewhere, it would be sometimes in a scenario, if they're not strong enough, if that's kind of the main aspect of their game that's holding them back, it would be a time where you'd go, okay, can we take maybe 6 months to really hammer strength? And that's, of course, not 6 months in complete absence of BJJ or judo, but it is a time period where we're really balancing those and we're not favouring our sport-specific stuff as much as possible. Whereas for striking combat sport athletes, I can't really imagine a scenario where you'd ever need to do that. And I couldn't imagine one where you would be justified in doing that with them. Whereas for grapplers or wrestlers and stuff, there really is a big component of being as strong as possible, And that's kind of one of the gripes you'll see with people talking about, I can do all my strength training for grappling with kettlebells and stuff, and you're like, you just, you just can't, especially as you get to the heavier classes, it's so. Maybe you could do that as a 40 or 50 kilo male or female athlete. You could do stuff with 48 kilo kettlebells that'll help you some force production. But if you're in the rounds of 100 kilos, 20-30 kilo kettlebells won't be cutting it when the other guy, if he can bench 160 or 170, or in squat 220 or something like that, so there is a distinct difference. It is a good question. In practicality, it would be like priorities. Actual programming details wouldn't really change that much. For athlete selection, exercise selection and stuff like that wouldn't be vastly different. It would just be the magnitude of how you want to get those numbers. Those absolute numbers would be the big difference. For a striking athlete, you could look for minimal improvement over the course of nearly 3 to 4 years if you could maintain certain numbers. Whereas for a grappling athlete, you'd be really looking for a year-on-year improvement until you get some of those higher bodyweight ratio lifts. So like, double bodyweight squat and plus, things like that. This is why we didn't do them all in one video, because there's too much to talk about. Thanks for asking. If you still want to get your question in, if you see this video before the other ones are done, you can leave them in the community post or on the short we posted. There's a lot of good questions, so we'll get into a lot of them.